Imagine being so beautiful that even a mad emperor would be willing to tear apart all the laws of Rome just to call you his wife. Few people know this story, and what you're about to hear might completely change the way you see the decadent Roman Empire and the emperor who became synonymous with cruelty, Nero, because behind the fires, the persecutions, and the cold-blooded murders, there's a name whispered through the corridors of history: Sporus. But who exactly was Sporus? And what was it about him that drove the most powerful man in the ancient world to commit such a bizarre act that even today leaves historians utterly speechless? Get ready, because this story isn't just about luxury, power, or depravity, but about a young Roman, described as so incredibly beautiful that his appearance was almost feminine, and in a world where masculinity and strength were the pillars of male honor. This ambiguous beauty of Sporus became even more hypnotic and dangerously desirable. But here's a detail almost no one talks about. No ancient source ever reveals Sporus's full name. No one knows exactly where he came from or who his parents were. Not even his age is known when he fell into Nero's clutches. What scholars suspect, and this is another detail often swept under the rug, is that Sporus was very young, possibly still a teenager, which perfectly fit Nero's disturbing pattern of attraction toward beardless boys with soft features, still in the bloom of youth. And this is where the story begins to take on even more bizarre contours. What happened next was so far outside the norms, so scandalous, that it became an absolutely unique episode in the history of Rome. A Roman emperor decided to marry, publicly, a young castrated boy. Yes, you heard that right. A real marriage between the man who ruled the greatest empire in the world and Sporus, now transformed by force into the emperor's object of pleasure. But to understand why Nero would go this far, we need to talk about the woman who became the greatest obsession of his life, Poppaea Sabina. Few people realize, but the story of this young eunuch connects directly to the ghost of a woman so beautiful, so mesmerizing, that she dominated not only Nero's heart, but also his political mind. Poppaea Sabina, her name echoed through the Roman palaces as the very embodiment of almost supernatural beauty. And Poppaea wasn't just a pretty face. She was intelligent, cunning, and ambitious, able to maneuver through the corridors of power with the same grace with which she dazzled the imperial banquets. So great was her influence that Nero did something absolutely unthinkable to keep Poppaea by his side. He ordered the murder of his own mother, Agrippina. Yes, can you imagine a man killing his own mother just to be free to marry the woman he desired and rule as he wished? That was Nero, and that was the power Poppaea held over him. But if the beginning of this story already sounds heavy to you, the end was nothing short of a true nightmare. In the year 65 AD, something unthinkable happened. Poppaea Sabina, 6 months pregnant, died after being violently kicked in the abdomen by Nero himself. During a domestic argument, Nero is said to have lost control in a fit of rage. Perhaps it was jealousy, perhaps simply the explosive temperament of an emperor growing ever more unstable. What's certain is that Poppaea, with her womb crushed, did not survive, and with her, the child's son or daughter she carried also died. And here comes something as intriguing as it is cruel. Her death shook Nero deeply, but not necessarily out of remorse. On the contrary, even the accounts that speak of his grief describe him as being far more concerned with maintaining public appearances and performing formal tributes than with genuine sorrow. He declared official mourning throughout the empire. He ordered temples built in Poppaea's honor, and he went so far as to demand that the Senate declare her a goddess. It was as if he wanted to wash the blood from his hands by covering everything in gold, incense, and divine statues. But none of this could fill the emptiness Poppaea had left behind, because from that moment on, Nero began desperately searching for someone who could replace her. No woman seemed enough. No face, no body, no voice could recreate the image Nero held in his mind of his ideal wife. And it was in this abyss of obsession that the emperor found Sporus. And what Nero did next is something so shocking, so absurd, that even Roman chroniclers wrote about it with disgust and disbelief. While Rome was still draped in mourning for the divine honors bestowed upon Poppaea, Nero, The emperor, who had already lost his mother, his wife, and control over himself, could not find peace. With every gleaming mosaic that reflected his face, Nero searched desperately for an echo of the woman he had lost. And then his eyes fell upon a young man whose name, until then, few people even knew: Sporus. Nero's encounter with Sporus wasn't merely the result of lust or sexual whim. There was something far darker, almost disturbing, behind this obsession. Sporus bore such a striking physical resemblance to Poppaea that he seemed like a living ghost of the dead empress. Ancient sources like Castrated describe Sporus as having extremely fair, almost translucent skin, something considered incredibly beautiful in Roman aesthetics. His features were delicate, soft, fine, so feminine that, from a distance, one could swear they were looking at a young woman. And for Nero, it was as though fate had delivered Poppaea back to him in a new form. He became obsessively determined to transform Sporus, physically, into a woman. It was a desperate attempt to recreate Poppaea, not merely in spirit, but in flesh and blood. And thus, the cruel destiny of Sporus began to unfold. If the story already has you hooked, make sure to hit that like button right now, because what comes next is even more bizarre. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated. Yes, you heard that right. Nero, Emperor of Rome, commanded that a young man be physically mutilated, in a mad attempt to turn him into the living replica of Poppaea. Ancient sources don't go into sordid detail about the surgery, but they all agree on one point. The castration was performed to eliminate masculine traits and try to make Sporus more feminine. No one knows precisely how the procedure was carried out. Roman surgical techniques varied greatly, ranging from relatively controlled methods using heated instruments to brutal procedures done without any anesthesia apart from alcohol or opium. But regardless of how it was done, the consequences for Sporus would have been profound. And here's another detail that's often overlooked. The castration almost certainly involved the removal of the testicles, and that changed everything in Sporus's body. Without testosterone production, his facial features might soften, his voice become higher, and his body lose much of its masculine muscle mass. In Nero's eyes, Sporus was beginning to resemble Poppaea even more. Of course, castrating young men to turn them into eunuchs was not unheard of in the Roman or Eastern world. There were eunuchs in the court, in domestic service, and even in religious temples. But nearly always this served political, administrative, or religious purposes. The case of Sporus, however, is unique in Roman history because it was done for one reason alone: to satisfy the sexual and emotional obsession of the emperor. And it didn't stop there, because after the castration, Nero began his final masterpiece: the public transformation of Sporus into Poppaea. Picture the scene. Sporus, now stripped of his masculinity, began to be dressed in women's clothing. Nero had his hair braided, veiled him in silk, adorned him with pearl necklaces, bracelets, rings studded with precious stones, and even applied makeup to enhance his feminine features. And don't think this happened merely in the shadows of the palaces. Sporus began accompanying Nero in public, as his wife, banquets, festivals, processions, official ceremonies, even meetings of the Senate or receptions for foreign ambassadors. Sporus was always there, at the emperor's side, wearing gowns and jewels worthy of an empress. And here's something that still leaves historians utterly stunned. Nero began calling Sporus in public Poppaea. This wasn't merely some sexual game. It was a psychological delusion. Nero, before the eyes of all Rome, was attempting to resurrect his dead wife in the form of a castrated young man. Imagine the atmosphere among the senators, generals, and nobles. And if it were you, could you pretend everything was normal? Or would you show disgust? What would you do knowing that crossing Nero could cost you your life? Even in Roman society, where extravagant sexual practices were hardly shocking, the elite was horrified. And if you think nothing else could possibly scandalize Rome, brace yourself, because Nero decided to make the unthinkable official. Everything Nero had been planning, the castration, the feminine clothing, the jewelry, the makeup, led to a single objective: to hold a public wedding between the Emperor of Rome and Sporus. Yes, you're not hearing wrong. Nero, the most powerful man in the ancient world at that time, chose to take a step that even the most decadent emperors had never dared to take. He celebrated an official marriage with a young man he had castrated, treating him as his wife. And this wasn't done in secret. Hidden away in the shadows of the Palatine Hill, it was a public event, in the presence of witnesses. According to sources like Cassius and Suetonius, Nero organized a full ceremony. He followed every ritual, calling Sporus his wife in public, leading him by the hand as tradition dictated, and allegedly even exercising marital rights, treating Sporus as his legitimate spouse. This is what profoundly scandalized Rome, because here's the thing, Rome tolerated sexual excesses, orgies, lovers, even homoerotic relationships under certain circumstances. But there were cultural limits that, for Romans, were never to be crossed. Could an emperor have male lovers? Yes, it happened, and it wasn't unheard of. But to marry a castrated man publicly, dress him as a woman, and call him the official wife, that was seen as a total inversion of the social and moral order. It was a direct affront to Roman tradition. Ancient sources report that this marriage was viewed as the pinnacle of Nero's moral decay. For many, it was the moment when the emperor completely severed any semblance of normality. Because of these actions, in 68 AD, Nero's world collapsed. The legions rebelled. The Senate declared him a public enemy. And the man who had set Rome ablaze murdered his mother and wife, and married a boy. Ultimately took his own life. Nero died at age 30, plunging a dagger into his throat while whispering, "What an artist the world is losing." Meanwhile, Rome breathed a sigh of relief. But for Sporus, the emperor's downfall did not mean freedom, because Sporus, that young man whose life had been shaped into the image of Nero's delusions, survived the emperor's fall, and, in a way, he fell into a new labyrinth of power. Sporus became entangled once more in the imperial court. Some say he was protected by Otho, one of the men who succeeded Nero, the same Otho who, ironically, had also been married to Poppaea before she wed Nero. Isn't it unbelievable how these destinies intertwined? Sporus then passed from one emperor to the next, always under the wing of some powerful figure, always at the mercy of the next ruler or the next scandal. But Rome had a long memory, and to the city, Sporus wasn't just another courtier. He was the living symbol of Nero's decadence, and that was what ultimately sealed his tragic fate. Cassius tells us that, after passing through the hands of powerful men, Sporus was faced with a new terror. He was to be forced to participate in a public theatrical performance that mocked the marriage he had once had with Nero. Imagine the horror of that. After everything he had endured, to be exposed yet again before all of Rome, ridiculed on stage, turned into a living joke of the dead emperor. For Sporus, who had already been transformed into Poppaea, this was unbearable, and so he chose death. There are no details about how it happened. No source says whether it was poison, a blade, or some other means. What we do know is that Sporus chose suicide rather than be paraded on a stage and displayed as the sexual trophy of an emperor Rome wanted to forget, but never truly could. Sporus died not merely to escape shame, but perhaps to try and reclaim something that Nero had stolen from him forever: his own identity. And even in death, Sporus did not vanish from history. His name kept echoing through the centuries as a cruel reminder that, in the hands of a tyrant, not even a person's body, nor their identity, is safe. And now I ask you, how far do you think human madness can go when someone holds absolute power? Do you think Nero was the craziest of all the emperors? Or are there even worse stories out there? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. If this story shocked you as much as it has shocked historians for centuries, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so YouTube keeps bringing you more content like this. And if you think nothing can top Nero's madness, just wait until you hear about the most disturbing punishment in the Persian Empire, known as scaphism.